everybody. This is Excel Pivot Tables training and demonstration. So glad to have you all. And this is what we're going to be covering today. So here are some of the topics. What is a pivot table all the way through, creating pivot tables and designing them, inserting calculations if we have a chance, adding more than one type of calculation. So you're going to see this today. Now, there are plenty of basics that I need to tell you. So I'll be starting right from the beginning. I do want you to know, and I put it in the chat as well, that on October 20th, we will be having the advanced pivot tables training. So if you are interested in signing up for that, I would love to have you in the advanced pivot table training. And I'll go over that date again at the end of this presentation, but that is October 20th. So here are what we're going to go over. And just in case you already know all of this, I'd say stick around because, again, depending on the version that you've used in the past, things have changed. So I want to make sure that you see this. Now, what version are you using right now? So if you're using version 10, 13, 16, or 19 and the desktop version, great. If you're using maybe the Office 365 version, great. Some things may be limited in the Office 365 subscription version, but typically you'll be able to do pivot tables. Some things are new from version 13 on, like slicers, and we'll be doing slicers in the advanced training. All right, let's keep going. So we learned about how to chat today. We answered the questions already. Thank you for doing that. Now, let's talk about the benefits of using a pivot table. So, as I mentioned to you, it's a great idea if you have some previous knowledge on using tables or databases in Excel. If you don't, that's okay. Still stick around. You're going to learn quite a few things. But using a pivot table helps you to analyze the data. It's more like a reporting tool. You're analyzing data to arrive at decisions that you need to make based on the data that you're working with. Now, before you start using a pivot table, here are some of the things that really you should do to your data. Your data should be set up in a certain way before you can use a pivot table. So if you need to analyze the data, if you need to report on certain information from a database, use a pivot table. But no blank columns and no blank rows in your data. You can have blank cells, but if they are values that are used in formulas especially, you'll want an empty cell to have a 0 in it. You want to be able to make sure that your dates are formatted not as text, but as dates. And you should convert your data into a table. So all of this is learned in my Excel database training. And again, that's on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and take a look at it. But again, I might just bring up some of these basics as we go along as well. So this is what you do before you start. And so remember I mentioned I'm going to be jumping in and out of using Excel. And so I'll be using different types of Excel spreadsheets in order to show you what the data should look like. So I also wanted to remind you that you're going to get these slides at the end of this presentation, and these slides have the directions. So pivot tables, you're going to learn, can be created in the same workbook as the source data and even on the same worksheet. You can also create worksheets from external sources of data, from another workbook or from another type of software. We're going to be doing the basics, and as I mentioned, we'll do the advanced training on October 20th. So we're going to be working with worksheets and getting data from the worksheets that are in the workbook. So let's take a look at one of these worksheets. And I do want you to see that I'm going to be using very simple data. And the reason why I like to use simple data when I'm teaching is that it won't it won't be complicated. I don't want anything to be complicated and hard to understand. I want it to be easy to understand. So notice the first column. The first half year, so January through June, is listed here. Stores. There are stores in Boston, Chicago, Dallas, Kansas City, New York City. What do they sell? They sell products, and they sell the same products sometimes in each store. Some products are only sold in certain stores. We count the number of units that were sold of those products, and this is what this spreadsheet is about. We also keep track of who the sales rep is that sold the product, in what store, what product, how many, and what month. So this is a very simple database. It's been turned into a table. That's why you're seeing it can be any color, but I'm using blue, as you can see here. And the down arrows are for sorting and filtering. And this is a table. And this table is very simple. If you want to add more information, you just go to the bottom and start typing. If you needed to add another column, you just go to that column, leaving no empty columns, and making sure that you just type right beside the last column. And because it's a table, it'll all be incorporated in. So adding data into a table is very simple. Just go to the last row and start typing. You can also sort by using the down arrows that show up when you created this table, and you're able to sort in ascending or descending, and you're also able to filter by the store or whatever column you are in. So a lot of us will just use the sorting and the filtering. For example, maybe I only want to see what was sold in Boston. So I'll come down here after clicking this arrow, select all to get rid of all the check marks, and Boston, I'll click on Boston and click OK. Now, these are things I would highly recommend that you knew before you came, but that's okay. You can always go back and practice them more. But notice I'm only seeing, it's only filtering out the store Boston. Now, maybe I'm interested in only the sales rep. And what sales rep? Let's say Augustine. And now I can see when, where, what, and how many of these products were sold by this particular sales rep in Boston, last name Augustine. So you're able to filter, and then you can sort as well. By, for example, if I click the down arrow by units, I'll be able to do largest to smallest. Now, this is not a pivot table, of course. This is just plain sorting, filtering a table. And a table is just a simple database. And when I went to insert off of the ribbon, and I chose table to turn it into a table. So now I'm able to see this data, print this data, copy and paste this data, as well as going back to the data tab, clearing using the clear button in the sort and filter group, and all the data comes back. So again, if you've never used sorting, filtering, or subtotaling before, go ahead and watch those videos on YouTube. But these are some basic things that I'd like you to be able to just know that you can do, because from here, we're going to then build a pivot table. And you can build a pivot table from any of the data after you filter it or after you sort it, or if you just have all the data here, you can certainly build a pivot table. So the pivot table is taken, this is called the source data, and you're going to decide what you want to see. Now, the advantages of a pivot table are that you don't have to see all the data. You can just pick and choose what fields you would like to see. So for example, I'm just going to give you some examples of what a pivot table looks like. It looks like a database. So notice at the bottom here, I'll show you how this was done in a moment, but I want you to notice stores. So when somebody comes into this particular workbook, they'll click on stores, and this right here is a pivot table. Don't look over here on the right. You'll understand it soon, but here are the results. The stores and the sum of the units sold and the grand total. So we sold 2,450 products from January through June. And notice when I click my mouse here, I can right click then, sort, let's say smallest to largest, and we'll see that New York City is selling the least amount of products. Kansas City is selling the most amount of products. So where did this come from, everybody? This came from the source. Notice down on my bars at the bottom, my tabs, I have sales. This is my source data. When I built that pivot table, I asked to see the stores. And what does a pivot table do? It sums up the data. So here are the instructions, and this is what I'm going to demonstrate. And I want you to notice step number 5. I'm going to show you how to put a pivot table on a separate worksheet. So a sheet at the bottom, it is going to be in the same workbook as the source data. Later, I'll show you how to create a pivot table that is on the same worksheet. But first, we're going to create a pivot table on a separate sheet. All right, so we're going to go back to that same file here. I start by clicking my mouse anywhere in this table, so in the database. I come on up to the Insert tab, and Pivot Table is the first choice. When I click on Pivot Table, a dialog box is going to pop up. There are going to be choices here, and honestly, I want you to understand these choices because really all I have to do is OK right now, but let's see what it's doing. Select a table or range. Well, this table that I created, I actually named Table 1. Now, if I didn't give it a name, it would have the cell addresses. For example, A2 through, let's see, E31, and they would be absolute cell addresses that would be mentioned here. But I know I named this table, Table 1, and that's where it's going to get the data from. I could use an external data source, as I mentioned, and we'll do that in the advanced. Notice it says here, choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed. You have 2 choices. New worksheet is the default. An existing worksheet I'll show you later. And then later in the advanced, we'll also talk about data models. So right now I'm going to build a pivot table on a new worksheet. So I didn't make any changes here. All I have to do is click OK. Now when I click OK, I want you to look on the left at this pivot table diagram, and on the right is where we're going to keep our eyes right now, and you're going to see all of the fields from your source data, from sales that you were in when you did insert pivot table. And so here are all the fields from my sales database, and I can choose what I want. So let's say I choose store and I choose units. What is the default for a pivot table? A pivot table always sums, adds up, totals, gives subtotals and grand totals of the data that you are asking for. So if you don't have data with numbers in it, it's hard for Excel to sum them up, right? So could I change this to counting or doing an average or a max or standard deviation? And the answer is yes. But the default is that it will sum up the units. Now notice the 2 check marks here, store and units. And because units, watch when I go back to sales, units is the, I'll highlight so you can see, is the column that has the numbers in it. As a default, a pivot table always adds them up by the category that you chose. Now you don't have to just choose one category. Take a look. I'm going to now click on sales rep. Notice now the sales reps are listed under Boston, Chicago, Dallas, Kansas City, New York City. And so now there is a subtotal of 434 units for Boston, 116 were sold by Augustine, and 318 by Winters. But I would like to see what product were sold, right? So I'm going to click now on product. Now I want you to notice under Boston, Augustine and Winters is still here. And under Augustine and Winters, you'll see the products that were sold. And again, for Chicago, Kenton Pulaski, Dallas, Fuller and Stein, Kansas City, Connor and Jones, and in New York City, Jones, Richardson's, Rodriguez, and Smith. These are the sales reps. This is where they sell their products. This is what products were sold. This is how many were sold. Remember, this is all through a January through June timeframe, right? But what if I wanted to see a certain time frame? Notice right here, I'm going to click on first half year. And now it comes up and it says January, April, May. That's a little difficult to read or understand when it's putting the date like this, don't you think? So I am going to eventually show you how to maneuver, manipulate, move your field names so that they're more easily read. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So I did not create the cell grand total. It is a default of creating a pivot table. What you do, I'm going to take all the check marks off now. You first start, you get this little diagram, you ignore it, you come over here to the right, and you decide what fields you want to start with. The order that you click in is the order that will show up in the pivot table. So if I wanted to just see sales reps, I would click on sales reps. Notice Excel will put all the names of the sales reps. If I click on units, I will see a total, which is first the subtotal of each sales reps. Now this is not money, this is the number of units sold. And I can see by sales rep. And as I mentioned before, notice what I'm going to do here. I can right click, sort, let's say smallest to largest, and let's say there was a contest. And whatever salesperson sells the most in this half year, they're going to go on a trip. So who's going to get that trip? Connor. Now, what if there was a contest that said whichever store sold the most products is going to get a little makeover? Well, instead of sales reps over here, I'm going to take the check mark off sales rep and do store. Right click, sort, smallest to largest. Which store is going to get a makeover? It's going to be Kansas City. Now, another thing that you might say, all right, I want to know what product is selling the best, selling the most of. What product are these sales reps selling? So when I click on product, notice I see a list of the products. I can right click on the sum of units, sort, smallest to largest. 713 monitors is the best seller. So monitors are the best seller. USB drives are not as great a seller. And so maybe we'll have to do a little bit more marketing when it comes to selling USB drives. Or maybe this is an older type of technology that is not being used as much. And so we're looking at what we're going to sell in the future. There are many reasons for doing a pivot table and you deciding what you want to click on here. Remember, what you click on first, second, third will make a difference on how this shows over here on the left-hand side. So what is pivot tables doing automatically? Subtotaling and totaling automatically by whatever field that you choose has the numbers in it. And I want to prove this to you. Look over here with me on this. It's called the pivot table fields. It's a little window over here on the right that popped up automatically. Notice sum of units. That is the default. Pivot tables are going to sum up whatever I click on. Now, it can't sum up products by itself, so if I take units off, there'll be no numbers here. Units is the field that has the numbers in it. So what do you think so far? Any questions you would like me to stop at this point and ask? Feel free to do so. If I find that they are more advanced questions, then I'll save them for a little bit later. But anything that you want me to clarify at this point before we move on? How are those people that have never used databases before? How are you feeling, everybody? Okay, so someone wants to know, how did this pop up? Let's go back to sales. You start with your source data. You go to Insert, Pivot Table. It'll create a new worksheet for you using this data, and I click OK. Excel, when I click OK, is looking at the field names on my source data and automatically giving me the pivot table field list with these fields. And I can decide what it is I want to see. Now I want you to notice sheet 1 down here are the products. So I might double click on this and call this product sales. And then sheet number 2, this is the store. So I'll call this store sales. And sales right down here, maybe we'll rename this to all sales. That way there, it'll make more sense when you're looking at your sheets at the bottom. Now, another question, and this is a very basic question, and I thank you for asking it. How does it know to include row 1? Okay, so let me back up, everybody. This question is a great question, and it's asked because the prior knowledge of databases, if you had prior knowledge of databases, you would know this. But again, for so many of us, we don't have that prior knowledge. So please let me answer this question, everybody. When you're working in a database, you type everything in and leave no empty columns and no empty rows. And the first row is typically labels that you type. We call this a header row, or we call these field names. So it doesn't have to be row 1 in a database, but it has to be right above your data. So in this case, in this particular spreadsheet, it's row 1. And then I want you to watch my screen. Don't blink, everybody. I'm going to go to Data, and then this Sort button. And I want you to see this dimmed check mark right here. My data has headers. That is built in to Excel to always look at the first row, and an empty row above it says this is the first row. If it's on row 1, this is the first row. It always knows that the first row in a table or a database, which means basically the same thing, is the first row where the field names are. Let's look at another database for a moment to help everybody with this answer. So I'd like you to take a look at this particular spreadsheet now. This is Splash Theme Park. This is a company that has employees. Look at row 4. This is the header row. Row 3 is empty, so this is not part of the database. Column J is empty. This is not part of the database. And let's go down to the bottom. Row 42 is empty at this time, so this is the end of the database. And everything in between, because there's no empty columns and no empty rows, this is your database. So watch, if you would, everybody. Name, employee number, division, department, the date they were hired, the benefits, the hours, their hourly rate, And then a formula is here for the gross pay, multiplying the hours times the hourly rate. This is a worksheet. We turned it into a table doing insert table, no empty columns, no empty rows. So automatically, if I go to data and I go to sort, my data has headers. It always knows the first row is the header row. It's built into Excel because that is checked off. My data has headers. So watch everybody if you would. If I go to insert pivot table, it's going to be on this particular worksheet called splash theme. This table is table 1 because it's turned into a table. I'm going to put my pivot table on the new worksheet and watch when I click OK. Where did it get name, employee number, division, department, date of hire, hourly hours, hourly rate, and gross pay from? Where did it get those from? It got them from the source data. In this case, it's called employees on row 4. Very good, everybody. So those of you that are answering, you got it. Making sense? So if you build your data properly, then you can be guaranteed that Excel will automatically look at the first row. As long as there's an empty row above it, that's considered the header row. Okay? And you would learn that, and you'll relearn that when you review, possibly either come to a database training. The thing is it won't be for another month or so. So I would suggest you go and take a look at the YouTube channel if you want to learn a little bit more about, database setup and so forth. So great questions. Excellent. Don't hesitate to ask any questions. Now, someone asks, did you highlight the entire table? No, never have to do that anymore. So let's say version, you used to use version, 2003, or use version 7, you had to highlight. Once version 10, 13, 16, and 19 came on the scenes, there's no highlighting. All you have to do is click in the database, okay? So isn't that a great thing that these new versions only allow you to click? I mean, you could highlight, but there's not necessary anymore. That was always a pain to do that. So you click in the database. I'll do it again. Insert, pivot table. I'm going to put it on a new worksheet. I click OK. So now at the bottom, I have sheet 1 as a pivot table that I haven't created yet, and sheet 2 as a pivot table I haven't created yet. So I can always name these, but let's say I go to sheet 1 and I decide that I would like to see the divisions, which are the locations. So everybody works in either Canada or the United States. And remember, what does a pivot table do, everybody? What's the purpose of a pivot table? Summing up the data, that's right. So let's say I want to sum up the gross pay. This is the salaries. So this is the payroll. So let's say this is payroll for whatever date. And this is all, take a look. I'm going to highlight this column so you can see what I'm doing. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger as well. There we go. And I'm going to right click, and you can go and you can format the cells, and you can choose currency or accounting, either one. Or you could have just used the shortcut buttons on your ribbon. But this is money. So we're spending $10,476 for gross pay, payroll in Canada. And this is again before taxes. So again, if the spreadsheet had taxes in it, notice the spreadsheet does not have taxes. I can't get that data out of there if it's not in the original database. So sheet 2. Sheet 1 is what? It's the gross pay. So it's the payroll. Sheet 2, maybe we want to know what departments there are and how many hours people are working in those departments. And remember, I can come over here. Let me make this bigger for you, everybody. I can right click, sort, smallest to largest. So these are the hours that were worked. So I might put department hours. Okay, someone's asking, what if I add a row? What if I add a column? I did go over that already. Just remember one thing. Let's take a look. Because this is a table, everybody, I'll demonstrate. If I come down to the last row and I'll put Jan Romano, I'll type in a number here. I'll say I work in the United States. I sing and dance in the shows. I was hired today. So that's 10/14/21. And you can see as I'm typing, it's including it in the blue. Okay. And then I'll say that I work 28 hours. Oh, let's say I make $50 an hour. Wouldn't that be nice? And automatically when I hit enter, it automatically does the formula. Now, if there was an additional column, all I would do is click here and I would type in that column. Let's say the column is going to be, oh, I can't even think about what that column would be. I'll just type blah, blah, blah. And so notice when I hit enter, it fills every row in with the blue, and whatever I type in is now included. So let's say I put here parking. So parking fee, let's say. So I'm just going to put $5, make that look like money, and then I'll copy it down. And then let's say $6, and I'll copy that down. So now it's very easy to add into your table. The only thing is, watch when I go back to, for example, payroll, or maybe department hours, and I come over here on the right-hand side, do you see that parking over here on the right-hand side? No, but what you can do is this. You're going to learn that a pivot table comes with 2 new tabs across the top. When I go to, I'll come back to this in a moment. Here we go. Working with pivot tables, you get the Analyze and the Design toolbars that pop up. The Design toolbar is to give you options to make the pivot table look good. And the Analyze tab has many buttons on there, and one of them is the Refresh button. So let me go back to our database. Hold on a second. And when I come up to the pivot table Analyze and I find the refresh, now I'm going to refresh all of the pivot tables. I could refresh just the one that I'm in, but I'm going to refresh all the pivot tables. And you're going to be able to see any data that has changed. And you're also going to be able to see, look at parking fee has now popped up. So when I click on parking fee, I can get a total of the parking fee for each. Maybe we pay the parking fee, the company does. So for each department, we pay the parking fees for our employees. But refresh on the Analyze tab is how you would see any changes in this table, whether they were number changes, column changes, or row changes. Okay, great questions, everybody. And as you can see in this presentation, I was going to show you all of these, and we're going to talk about some of these buttons as we go. But let's back up just for a second. So we talked about creating a pivot table on a separate sheet. And I could keep practicing and practicing and showing you. Notice designing your pivot table. You click in these boxes, just like number 1 says. And the pivot table here, this diagram is replaced by the actual pivot table. And here's a pivot table based on what I've clicked on. So I wanted to see product and sum of units, and sum is the default. okay? Now you can edit field names and headers, which I'll show you. I showed you how to format by right-clicking on the value. You can also pivot the data, which I'm going to talk about. So let's go back to the Excel spreadsheet, and I'm going to go back to electronic sales. And remember, we did product sales and we did store sales. I'm going to stay here on store sales. Everybody okay with this? This is the source data. This is the pivot table I created that shows just the, look at the right if you like, the store and the products. And then I'm going to click on units to see the sum of the units. Now, there are ways of readjusting the look of your pivot table. And this is called, watch again in the presentation that you're going to get, this is called pivoting the data. That's why it's called a pivot table. The data can be pivoted. And this is the analogy that I use. I want you to think of someone playing basketball. When you're dribbling the basketball, you want to keep your feet on the floor, but one foot can pivot, can turn. Turning will help you get away from an opponent. Turning will let you go towards whatever direction you want to go and dribble. Turning your data will allow you to change the format, the look, and now actually analyze it hopefully better. So look right here. Pivoting the data to rows or columns is one way of transforming that data from maybe a tall, skinny format to a wide format. Maybe it's a short format. Maybe it's a wide format. Well, how do we do that? Well, look at this display right here. On your pivot table field list, we now know that you checked the boxes. But what is down here is where we can pivot the data. So let me go back to my real live Excel spreadsheet. This is a pivot table. You know this. I asked for store and product and sales reps. Notice right here at where it says rows. As a default, everybody listen to this. As a default, all of your field names are typically in rows. So here is on the left-hand side the store, the product, and of course the sum of the units always goes in its separate column. So over here in the bottom where it says rows, if I click this down arrow, I will see product and store. I can move product or store, or both if I want to, over to columns. That's the first thing I'm going to do. So I'm going to take store, point to it, hold down the left mouse button, drag it, and drop it in columns. Now, as I do that, store will show up here in columns, product will be in rows. Look at your pivot table now. That's exactly what it did. It put store across in the columns, it put products down in the rows, and you can look across if you prefer. Now, if you prefer to have border lines so that it's easier for you to look at, that's where you'd come up to the pivot table design tab that shows up on the right-hand side of your, this is your ribbon and these are your tabs. So I'm going to click on design. I'll click this down arrow and I'll find one of these ones that I prefer. So let's see if I can find one that I like better. So as I keep coming down and I move my mouse around, there may be ones that I prefer. Some with borders on the outside, some with shading, some with 2-color shading, and so forth. Okay? So you can always make a change to how your data looks with the colors. I'm going to leave it a little lighter so that it's easier to see. But you're still looking at your pivot table fields, and your store is in columns and your product is in rows. That goes for any pivot table. Watch, I'm going to go to product sales. Here's a small pivot table. I can change the design. I can also take product and bring it over to columns. And then it just shows me the sum and the grand total, and it goes across in columns. If I don't like it, I can just hit undo. This is very helpful when you have many fields that you want to work in. Watch, if you would, one more time. I'm going to click on all sales, which is my source data. I'll make a pivot table again one more time. Insert, pivot table. I'll put it on a new worksheet. Okay. I'm going to choose store, product, sales rep, first half year, units. We'll look over here on the left. It's a little difficult to read. So again, if I look over here on the right now, I will see the field called store, product, sales rep, first half year. Which one of those do I want to put in columns? That's totally up to you. I'll choose first half year and drag it over to columns. And now I can see January, February, March, April, May, June, and see what was sold. Now, I might like that, but look again here. Maybe I'm trying to focus on sales reps. So look what I can do. I want to talk about this box called filtering now. I'm going to take the word sales rep and drag it here to filters. What does that do? That takes it out of the initial pivot table here and puts it at the top as a field that I can filter by. So watch when I click the down arrow beside sales rep and it says all. It gives me a list of all the sales reps from my source data, and say I just want to see what Fuller sold. And I could do multiple. Notice it says multiple, but I'll just do Fuller and I'll click OK. So now I can focus on the sales reps. The sales rep Fuller works in Dallas and sold iPads, memory boards, and monitors. Maybe now I'll come back where this little funnel is, and I'll say I just want to focus on Richardson and click OK. Richardson works in New York City and only sells iPads. And this is what they sold. Now, I may want to also see by time, which in this case is first half year. So first of all, I'm going to go back up here and say all. These are all the products sold. I don't see what sales rep sold them because I put sales rep over here in filters at the top, so it shows up at the top. I might also want to filter by time. So watch, I can take first half year and drag it over here where filters are. And I can have two filters at the top. Much easier to read. And now I can really filter how much was sold in March. So I can see keyboards and memory boards were sold, keyboard and iPads were sold in March. I can see in January what was sold in January. If I change this back to all, I can see all the products. So again, watch, sales rep, let's say Pulaski. And let's say I want to see what Pulaski did in June. Pulaski sold USB drives in June, 45 of them. And this may not be exactly what you're looking for, meaning this data, but are you understanding how to do this so that you can glean and gather and take out from a big source of data and narrow it down to what you're looking for? So in a pivot table, it'll sum up whatever the field is that has numbers in it. You can move the fields to columns and rows to make it more visually interesting. And you can put as many fields as you want in filters so that you're able to filter out specific information. So what criteria would you be looking for is really what you're asking. And then you can use, I'll put all here so you can see, you can use a filter. Okay, so you could name this sales rep or filter by sales rep. Or you could say filtering or whatever you want to call your sheets. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint again. You can pivot and you can filter. So pivoting is pivoting rows and columns, what fields you want to see in rows and columns. And filtering is what fields you want to filter, which always go to the top, which allow you to click the down arrow and filter, and you can filter by multiple things. Any questions? Remember, you're working with your design and analyze toolbars when you need them. You can refresh and update your pivot tables. So if any so your pivot tables are dynamic. So when you update a value or you add a column or add a row like I showed you, it doesn't automatically refresh the pivot table. You need to go and refresh. And you'll find refresh in two ways. You can right click on the pivot table and choose refresh, or you can go to the Analyze tab under Pivot Table Tools and choose refresh. And you can name a pivot table. So let's just quickly go back and take a look at that. So what would be the name of this pivot table? I could go to Pivot Table Analyze, and I can click down arrow on Pivot Table and go to Options or type a name right here. So this could be filtering by sales rep. So it's the name that I used for my sheet name as well. So if you're constantly changing the data here in your source, then somebody, whoever that someone is, constantly has to hit refresh. There's no automatic way that Excel will refresh pivot tables. Okay? So someone would have to come and decide to refresh all. All right, let's take a look at this database. I love this small little database. So I have a trick question. Look at the salesperson name and look at the total invoice column. So whatever they sold, I don't know, it's not listed here, but I just want to know how many salespeople there are. So that's a trick question. Tell me how many salespeople there are. What would you guess? Put it in the chat. I see 2. Look again. I see 3. That's the answer I'm looking for. Exactly. So notice Jones, Smith, and Brown is repeated over and over again. Now, you don't know if they have Mary Brown and Joe Brown. I know that. But for now, we're going to say there are 3 salespeople, Jones, Smith, and Brown. Now, listen to what I want from here. I want to know how much money, these are invoices, these are sales invoices, how much money in sales did Jones bring into the company? I would have to add up the 15,000 here, plus the 18,000, plus the 16,000, plus the 15,000. Would you agree with that? Okay. Now you could filter, right? You could make this a table and filter, but it still wouldn't add it up. You could do a subtotal, that would add it up, or you could do a pivot table. Watch how quickly I'm going to get the answers for each one of these salespeople. I'm not going to do anything different than we already went over. So we click anywhere in the database. We go to Insert, Pivot Table. This is looking at absolutely cell A1 through B12. It's going to put the pivot table on a new worksheet. Thank you. I'm going to click OK. I get my diagram and my field list automatically. Here are the two field names that are from where? The source data. The source data, I'm going to call it sales people. So you know it. Sheet 4 is the pivot table. Look what I'm going to do. I'm going to click on salespeople and total invoice, and boom, there's the numbers. This is money, so I'm going to make it look like money. And now I can see how much money Brown, Jones, and Smith brought in by just quickly doing a simple pivot table. Pretty good? Now take a look. I want to also find out from this data how many invoices each salesperson brought in. So how many did Jones bring in? Put that in the chat. 4. That's right. How about Brown? 3, 4. How can you tell? Take a look. 1, 2, 3, 4. And Smith. Smith brought in 3, right? Well, watch this. I am going to build a separate pivot table, then I'll show you how to combine. I'm going to build a separate pivot table so that you can see something. And what do I want you to see? I want you to see, hold on a second, how to change the default calculation. I want to change, instead of summing, I want to count instead. Okay? All right, let's do it. Let's go and create a new pivot table. No, we don't have to, but I like to create it. Insert, pivot table. Okay, salesperson on a new worksheet, sure. I'll click OK. Salesperson and total, those are the two fields. And what is it automatically doing? Summing, right? But look down here with me. Do you see where it says sum of total invoice? I'm going to click this down arrow and go to the last choice on this menu that pops up called Value Field Settings. When I click on Value Field Settings, I'm going to get a dialog box that's going to give me a list of all the types of calculations that can be done in a pivot table. Summing is the default. I'm going to choose Count and click OK. And you were absolutely right. Brown brought in 4, Jones brought in 4, Smith brought in 3, so there were 11 invoices for whatever this time period is. A count and a sum. So I'm just going to name this down here so that you can see something. Count and sum, let's say, or total, I'll say. Total money, and maybe this is total invoices. Makes better sense, right? Okay. Let's do it together now. Insert, pivot table. Okay. Salesperson, total invoice. But I want a column that also shows me the count. So this is the money. I'll go home and make it money. But now I also want it to have a column called count. Look what I'm going to do. Oops, sorry. Something's showing up on my screen that you can't see. And it's spinning and spinning. So let's see if I can get rid of it. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to click in my pivot table. I'm going to come over here and say the total invoice is the dollar amount, right? That's I'm summing. So I want to take the total invoice and drag it down here to the value spot again. When I do that, it's going to show up twice. Sum of total invoice, sum of total invoice. And I'll get two columns that say sum. But I'm going to change this second one. Click on it, value field settings, choose count, click OK. Now, do you see the count? It looks like 4.0, and I'm going to take this. It's not money, is it? I'm going to change it to a number format off of the ribbon and decrease the decimals. And then I don't like the name of these columns. So row labels, I'm going to double click, highlight row labels, and I'll say these are the sales people. This is the sum of the total invoices. Okay. And this is the count of the total invoices. And I don't like this number 2 here. So when you single click, nothing happens. You could always go up to the formula bar. When you double click, you could also get this particular dialog box, and you could edit it here as well. There's many ways to edit. And so I will change the look. So what did we do, everyone? Let's go back and take a look at the information that you're going to get at the end here. So changing the calculation, right? So you get that. You're going to be, instead of sum, you're going to go to value field list, and we chose count. But how do you add more than one set of calculations to the same spreadsheet, which is a pivot table, right? You drag the field name to the value section down here again. And then you change that copy of that field name. So when you drag, it doesn't move, it makes a copy. And then you change, in this one, we change to count. What do you think about that? I feel like that's extremely useful to be able to add different mathematics in the same pivot table. All right, good. Some of you are saying great, very good. All right, excellent. So now I'm going to back up and let me go to the slide that talks about creating a pivot table on the same worksheet. Very easy to do. Remember step number 5 was saying a new worksheet? Well, look at step number, I think it was 4 or 5. Look in this step here, 4. We're going to say select the existing worksheet as where we want to put our pivot table. We're going to choose a location in the worksheet, which is a cell address. How are we going to do that? We're going to click in the cell that we want in the worksheet where we want the pivot table to be. So let's go ahead and try it. I'll go back to this simple spreadsheet again. Simple spreadsheet. No columns, no rows, no empty columns and no empty rows. And we want to build the pivot table right here, right on the same worksheet. So I always click in the data anywhere. I don't highlight, I just click. I go, as you've learned before, insert, pivot table. It is the salespeople tab, absolutely cell A1 to B12, yes. But now, instead of leaving it at new worksheet, I will click this circle that says existing worksheet. I will click in this white bar, box, bar, whatever you want to call it, that says location. And some people click on this arrow, I do not. What I do is just take my mouse and click where I want that pivot table to be. And notice salespeople is the name of the sheet. absolutely cell D2 is where I want to put that pivot table. So this is the source, A1 through B12. I'm going to create a pivot table in this existing worksheet starting in cell D2. Watch when I click OK, nothing changes. I get my pivot table field list automatically. I get my pivot table diagram here. I don't do anything different than I've learned before. I click on the fields that I want. And in this case, I want both of these fields, salesperson and total invoice. I can right click on these numbers and format the cells. It only does one cell at a time. So if I want to format more than one cell, I do highlight the cells in the pivot table. If I want to use my ribbon, I can use my ribbon or I can right click. Remember, if you also want a different mathematics or a different, in this case, count as well, we take total invoice, we drag it down to values. A copy of it is put here. You can see a sum of total is a copy. We click, we go to value settings, we change. Do we want an average, a highest, a lowest, standard deviation, variation? It's up to you. I'm going to do a count and click OK. And now let's make this a little bit smaller so that you can see. Here's the source data. Here is the pivot table. Remember, you can format any way that you want. And one last thing, just as a reminder, let's say somebody made a mistake on Jones's number here in the source data. So look at Jones's total is 64,000. But this should have been 45,000. Somebody put 15,000. Let me change this to 45,000 in the source data. The pivot table doesn't change. It does not change automatically until I click in it. Pivot Table Analyze is the tab I'll go to at the top on my ribbon and refresh. Now you can see Jones sold 94,000 with these 4 invoices. Is it clear? Oh, very good. Somebody puts remember to refresh. Absolutely. Very good. Okay. All right. So putting a pivot table on the same worksheet is quite simple. You're just telling it what cell you want to put that pivot table in. And changing the default calculation, you're going to get this slide. Adding more than one set of calculations is what we've done a couple of times, so you'll get this slide to remind you. Now, I'd like to show you a really fun tool called expanding. And I use the example here, Boston, Chicago, Dallas. Remember the store sales? So let's go back and take a look at the store sales. And I'm going to look at the source data, the years, the stores, the products, the units, the sales reps. And what we're going to do is we're going to take from this and build a pivot table again. And then I'm going to show you a way to what we call expand, which is a pretty cool tool. And then somebody write something in the chat and I'll look at that in just a moment. Okay, everyone? All right. So we're in our source data. Why don't I go to Insert and Pivot Table and OK, and a new worksheet pops up. And I want to see the store and the products and the units sold. Or how about just the store and the products? Or just the store and the units. Again, I'm just playing over here on the right by clicking and deciding, taking off the check marks. putting on the check marks, making a decision on what I'd like to see in this pivot table. Now, let's say somebody creates a pivot table, they send it, they email it to you, and you're looking at it and going, well, I'd really like to see more data. Watch, so easy. Watch when I bring my mouse right here to this Boston 434. Watch when I double click on it. Automatically, a new sheet is formed at the bottom with what? With the expansion of the data for Boston. Each product, how much was sold, what sales rep. How did that happen? I'm just going to name this Boston down here so we can go back to it. This was the pivot table that I just created, right? I double clicked on the 434 for Boston. How about if I double click on the 714 for Kansas City? What happens automatically? A new sheet is created. I'll make this very big so you can see it and widen the columns. I double clicked on the number for Kansas City, so a new worksheet down here is created. I'll call this Kansas City. It expands all the data from Kansas City. Making sense? This is again showing the stores. Hold on a second. Let's just make this bigger down the bottom. So these are the stores. Oh, that name's already given. So sales by store, I'll call it. I want to expand Chicago. All I do is double click on this value. And it expands it in a separate sheet. I can make it bigger, smaller, do whatever I want to it, widen the columns. And name the sheet. In this case, it'll be Chicago. So that's how you can create several pivot tables based on the one pivot table that you created from your database. So again, let's go one more time to Splash International Theme Park. Do you remember, we made a pivot table prior to this called payroll, showing Canada and the United States. Just the division and the total of the gross pay. Now I'd like to really see everything to do with Canada. And I want it on a separate sheet. It's like filtering. By just double clicking on this number, boom, a new worksheet is created. This is Canada. And it's all the information about Canada. It's been filtered out and put in a worksheet based on this pivot table. Now, how can you tell the difference between a pivot table and just a worksheet? So let's take a look. Employees. When I click on this, no field list pops up. Look at the top, no analyze, no design pop up. This is a database, which I turned into a table. I can tell that because the arrows are there in the blue coloring. That's the default. If I go down to the bottom to payroll, how do I know this right here is a pivot table? The pivot table field list pops up. Analyze and design pop up. Now, sometimes people will close this using this X, but pivot table analyze, pivot table design is going to pop up when I click inside this data. If I want my field list to pop up again, I go to pivot table, analyze, field list in the show group, pops that right back up. So are you going to be able to tell the difference if somebody emails you and you click on this Canada tab? Can you tell if this is a worksheet, database, I should say, or a pivot table? What is this? Is this a pivot table or is this just data in a database? It's a database, that's right. Why? Because again, no. Now, table design pops up because I can change the design because it came from a pivot table. Remember when I went to payroll and I double click on the United States' number, it automatically filters out all that data, puts it in a new worksheet, and now I have that data. Now, what if I go to the source data, everybody, and I change something? So let's say I take Joshua Macluso in the water rides in United States is going to get a raise. And they're going to get a raise to $25. Therefore, their gross pay goes up. What do I need to do? Go to one of these pivot tables. Okay. And yes, those of you that are putting in refresh, absolutely. You're going to refresh. So I'm just taking a look to see, where was that guy? There he is. Joshua Macluso still says he makes $21.50, right? We're going to go and refresh. And it will update that. Oh, what happened? Funny thing. Sometimes these things take a while for it to refresh. My PC is just a little slow. All right. How are we doing so far? It's 3:20 almost. I want to make sure that I look at the chat now. So we never change the data in the pivot table. We always go to the source data and make a change. Then we go to the pivot table and we refresh. Okay, so see this United States 16,000? Because that was refreshed already, $16,672.65 has been refreshed. And we refresh all of the sheets on the bottom. All right, hopefully that's helpful. That was a question that was asked quite a bit a few minutes ago, so I want to make sure that you get it. I don't understand this question. How did I get the pivot table workbench back when it disappeared? What's the workbench? This pivot table field list, is that what you're calling the workbench? I love that term, by the way. So if I use this X, I'll just assume that that's the answer unless I see something different in the chat. When I close this, how do I get it back? Don't click on an empty cell. If I click on an empty cell, I do not get the Analyze or the Design tabs at the top. I click inside the pivot table. I go to Pivot Table Analyze. I go to the Show Group.